The Open Curtain, Chapter 3. He asked around at school, trying to figure out which school bus would get him to South Provo and closest to Springville. He stumbled up onto it after the last bell. The driver looked at him suspiciously.
"I don't recognize you,"
he said. "I don't recognize you either," said Rudd and blushed.
"You sure it's my bus you want?"
Rudd nodded and passed into the back. There was a group of boys in the last seats playing 5-card stud for nickels across the aisle, one of them keeping a running tally on the inside cover of a geometry textbook. Howard somebody, Rudd heard announced, was kicking our asses. He squeezed into a seat between two students he half knew. "Dickwad," said one, punching him in the shoulder. He tried to hold his face neutral, looking straight ahead at the neck of the girl in front of him. He stayed on the bus as it went south, then east, students filing off. The bench in front of him opened, and he struggled out from between his half-acquaintances to take it. "Mother effer," the boy on the outer edge suggested as he struggled to force his legs past. The bus turned north. He stood up and moved toward the front, swaying against the rhythm. When it stopped, he got off, looked around for a city bus marker. The kid who had called him a mother effer was out near him and prancing about, asking Rudd if he wanted to fight. "I don't want to fight," Rudd told him without looking at him, which the boy took as his cue to shove him in the back. Rudd tumbled down, scraping his palms, dropping his books. Rudd stood up, straightening his glasses. He licked his palms, rubbed them against his jeans, slowly gathered his books. "You want to fight now?" the boy asked. Rudd shook his head. "What's wrong with you?" the boy asked. "Nothing," said Rudd. "I just don't want to fight." He started walking south. There was no city bus marker that he could see. The other boy pushed Rudd from behind again, and he felt his head jerk and snap. It made a muscle in his neck ache. He kept walking. A few steps later, the boy pushed him again. He stopped and put his books down. "I want to fight now," he said, held his fists awkwardly out. The other boy skittered a few steps back, smiled broadly. "F all," he said. "You're not worth my time." He was walking backwards on the side of the state route, his thumb out, books awkward under his arm, slowly passing the cement works when he saw the police car. He pulled his hand in and swiveled around. Putting his head down, he concentrated on walking forward. He heard the police car pull up beside him. "Hey," the officer said. He stopped and looked up. "Come over here," the officer said. He hitched his books higher under his arm. Walking over, he stood beside the car's open window. "What's your name?" "Rudd," he said, his voice wavering, breaking. "What's your first name?" "That is my first name." When the officer implied that he was a liar, Rudd showed him the name written inside the cover of a school book. "I'll be damned," the officer said. "What the hell kind of a name is that?" He pushed his hat back a little on his head and revealed a damp clump of hair. "You hitchhiking?" he asked. Rudd hesitated, but nodded. "Don't you know that's illegal?" Rudd nodded again. The police officer looked up at him. "Did anybody ever teach you to lie?" Rudd shook his head. "Not yet, anyway." "Get in," the officer said, and when Rudd tried to climb into the front, the back, Rudd got in, pushing himself over onto the seat, staring at the grill between himself and the officer. He reached out and touched it. Putting his books down on the seat, he carefully wrapped his fingers around the door handle. As the officer began to drive, Rudd pulled the handle, pushed on the door slightly. It didn't open. "Suppose you tell me where you're heading." "Springville." "I can see that. Where in Springville?" Rudd watched him through the grill. "I'm meeting my brother." "You live in Springville?" "No." "And your brother doesn't either, is my guess. You're going to Springville to raise hell?" "No, he lives there. Half-brother. It's kind of complicated." "It's always kind of complicated," said the officer, smiling. "That's what they all tell me right before I take 'em down to the station and book 'em." Rudd looked out the window. They would give him some change for a phone call. He would have to call his mother. If she was in a good mood, she would come down to the police station, drag him home, Yell at him a few hours, if not, anything could happen. He watched the trees flick by, then the county country western bar, the turnoff to reach the freeway. Welcome to Springville. Aren't you taking me the wrong way? You said Springville, right? But said Rudd. I thought. I figure a boy, roped with a first name like Rudd, already has about as much punishment as he can take. They came to the middle of the town, and the officer asked him where to go. He stuttered, started leafing through his books, looking for a scrap of paper with the address on it. Unless you were lying to me after all, said the officer, when after a moment Rudd still hadn't answered. I don't cut slack to liars. Rudd kept looking through the books. You could have just written the name in those books without it being your name. How do I know they're your books? Here it is, he said, and read the address. They drove to 3rd, turned, drove east a few blocks. It was a corner house in the middle of a square plot, the house itself squarish and small, thrown together with red brick, gray shingles. That's it? Asked the officer. I think so. You think so? He thanked the officer, tried again to get out of the car. The door wouldn't open. The officer, he saw, was out of the car, walking back. Rudd rearranged his books, moved them to his other hand. When the door was open for him, he stepped out. He was halfway to the front door when he realized the officer was following him. He turned slightly. Thanks for the ride, he said. You're welcome. You don't have to stay. The officer smiled wryly. I'd just like to see how the complications unravel. What do you mean? It means I want to see if you're telling the truth. Rudd turned slowly back. The door was a textured yellow, the paint puckering and flaking to reveal a gray-green undercoat. He looked at it, then at the doorbell inside. He reached out, pressed it. He could hear from within the house the chimes strike the first 8 notes of some tune that seemed familiar. He couldn't place what it was before the door itself was flung open, and standing before him was a boy much his own age, slightly blonder, slightly bigger. This is my brother, Rudd told the policeman, looking all the while steadily at the boy. Lyle. Lyle, the boy said. Lyle, said Rudd to the policeman. His name is Lyle. The boy looked at him and opened and closed his mouth. The officer took off his hat, held it by the visor, knocked the brim against his thigh. This is your brother? The officer asked the boy. You can see the resemblance, said Rudd. I want to hear it from his own lips. The boy licked his lips and shrugged. Yeah, sure, he said. He's my brother. The officer picked his way down the path, through the dandelion-ridden lawn and back to the cruiser. Rudd lifted his hand and smiled, waved as the cruiser pulled away. Before he could lower his arm, he was spun about, the boy's knuckles backhanding his face. He stumbled off the porch and into the hedge, his books scattering. He was still struggling to catch himself when Lyle's foot struck him hard in the stomach and sent him lurching onto the damp grass. Somehow, before he hit the ground, Lyle was already atop him, straddling his hips, knees pinning down his arms. Now tell me who you really are, Lyle said. I'm sorry, Rudd said. The world is full of sorry people, said Lyle. What's your game? Game? Lyle drew back his arm, slapped him. Rudd's cheek began to throb. Nobody uses me, said Lyle. Never. Start talking. Chapter 4. It wasn't until the next year, when Rudd had his driver's license and had saved enough money to buy a used scooter, that he began to see more of his half-brother, always at Rudd's initiative. It was a Vespa, white, very stylish as it turned out, though Rudd hadn't realized this when he bought it. He, in any case, was incapable of remodeling himself to fit the scooter, thus always felt slightly humiliated riding it. Lyle felt no better, he knew. He looked at least as out of place, maybe more, but he didn't seem to care. On a Friday or Saturday, Rudd would ride the scooter down 9th East toward Springville. He kept the scooter close to the side of the road, cars passing him or sometimes pressing close behind. He would stop halfway at the cement plant to use the payphone. If Lael was home, he kept going. If not, he sometimes kept going, sometimes went home. He thought of calling earlier from his house if he could get his mother off the telephone long enough, or from the gas station a few blocks away from his home. Yet there was satisfaction in the half-trip, in turning around to the cement plant with his brother unseen, as well as in the full trip. He had come to think of both as something he needed. Besides, mostly Lael was there. It was better when Lael was out in front, waiting for him when he arrived. Once he called, Lael always said he would be sitting on the curb, waiting, but he rarely was. Rudd would wait, balanced on his scooter, finally blowing his horn. Lael, when he came out, came slowly, maddeningly, as if disinterested. "I'm driving," he always said, and Rudd let him, not knowing where he would take them. They hardly talked, just drove. The rare moments when Rudd broke the silence, Lael answered succinctly, no wasted words. He gave away nothing. Weeks passed when Rudd learned very little of Lael. "Who are your friends?" he asked one day, holding onto the back of the seat as Lael labored the scooter up Spanish Fork Canyon. Lael flicked his head back slightly. "You wouldn't know them," he said. "Just give me some names." Taking his scooter off the highway, Lael slipped carefully down a gravel access road and parked near the railroad line. They walked onto the tracks, skipping rocks down the ties, then walked over the trestle and down the riverbank. "Come on," said Rudd. "Tell me something." Lael shrugged. "I don't think so," he said. When Rudd kept pushing, Lael took the scooter keys out of his pocket, threatened to throw them in the river. Rudd told his mother nothing anymore, certainly nothing about Lael. When she asked where he went each week, he made things up, mentioned the names of people at school he wanted to be friends with but wasn't. Blair Manning, for instance, who he pretended to her was a boy. He asked himself if he felt different, having a half-brother. Was certain it did, but he couldn't quite say how. Each weekend passed quickly. During the week, he woke up at 7 each morning to go to school. His mother, perhaps feeling she was losing him, finally bought him contact lenses. She began to hover uneasily around him in the evening. He started to resent her, succeeding in doing so until the weekend came and he drove off to see Lael again, then came back and lied to her. He would feel guilty and tender for a day, then start hating her again. They gradually adjusted to become tired of one another at approximately the same instant. By the weekend, he was ready to go, and she seemed glad, though she would never admit it out loud, to have him gone. He rolled the scooter out of the garage and out into the street, started off. He stopped at the cement plant, telephoned, but nobody answered. He kept driving anyways. Lael was not waiting outside. He parked outside the house, blew his horn, waited straddling the Vespa's saddle to see if he would come out. When he did not, Rudd kicked the scooter onto its stand, slipped off the back, and picked his way across the lawn and to the door. Lael's mother was already opening the door by the time he reached out to ring the doorbell. "Don't walk across the lawn," she said through the screen. "How many times do I have to tell you?" She'd never spoken to him before, at least not face to face. He'd only seen her peering through the drapes and once on the front porch with her arms folded across the front. "Sorry," he said. "What do you want here? Why do you come around here?" "To see Lael." "To see what?" she said. "Lael," he said. "Lyle?" she said. He said. "Your son," he was about to say, but she'd already shut the door. He stood on the concrete porch. After a while, he walked back to his scooter and sat on it. Putting his hands on the grips, he twisted the rubber. He could see Lael's mother still looking at him through the window from behind the curtain. He got off the scooter, started to cross the lawn towards the door, then doubled back and went up the walk. He rang the doorbell, was surprised that she opened it. "What is it?" she said. But before he could answer, she turned, was walking slowly back down the hall away from him. Then she was gone. He stepped into the house and stood just inside the door. He didn't know what to do with his hands. After a while, he stepped out again. 5 minutes later, he could see her coming down the hall again, toward him. Her hair was wet now, mascara streaking her face. And there was Lael suddenly behind her, gliding past. He came past her and onto the porch and past Rudd and across the lawn to the scooter. In the house, Lael's mother kept coming slowly towards Rudd, arms out. Rudd stood hesitating at the doorway, watching her. Her wrists, pushed in front of her, seemed thick, almost swollen. Behind him, he heard Lael kick the scooter to life. "Come on!" Lael called, cupping his hands to his mouth. "Come on!" Rudd turned to go and left the porch, trying not to look behind him. He ran out to the street, climbed on. "What was that all about?" Rudd asked. Lael shook his head and laughed. "Welcome to my world," he said, and drove. It was a phrase that for a time was caught in his head. "Welcome to my world." He heard it for hours at a time, over and over again, always in Lael's voice. Sometimes he realized his own lips were moving. It was like a virus, as if a part of Lael, translated into speech, had penetrated into his skull. As it cycled, he waited to see if it would take hold of a portion of his head completely, or fade into the babble of borrowed and now indecipherable voices upon which the whole anxious and tenuous surface of the thought was awash. At night, in bed, he stared up at the ceiling and thought of Lael. It had taken Rudd weeks to tell him what he knew, to reveal to Lael that they were half-brothers. Yet when he had, there had been no shock, no surprise. "Tell me something I don't know," Lael had said. "You already knew? Why didn't you tell me? I could ask the same of you." He always had a sense that any moment Lael would be willing to walk away and never see him again, that the only reason Lael saw him now was out of a kind of indulgence. Whether of Rudd or of himself was hard to say. He was little more than tolerated, Rudd felt, and the closer he grew to Lael, the more he felt how much he felt himself apart. It made him wish that Lael's voice saying, "Welcome to my world," would swell and expand and take him and consume him. And then in his worry, he forgot the phrase for a time before it sprang on him again, unawares, a static vision of Lael, flashing up before his eyes in accompaniment. Chapter 5. Things began to go odd on one of their many long rides, this one up Provo Canyon, to the picnic tables at the foot of the mountain, beside the railroad trestle that crossed the river. They were sitting there, beside the scooter that had driven past the chains and over the gravel paths, watching the swirl of the water, the motor ticking as it cooled, when Rudd realized Lael was staring at him. "What is it?" Rudd asked. Lael shrugged and kept staring. Rudd made a point of looking away down at the water. He kept his eyes there, then followed the trestle up to the top to where some kids were drinking beer from 7-Up bottles and sunning themselves, sometimes jumping into the pool below. When he allowed himself to flick his gaze back, Lael was still looking at him. "What? You really don't hide anything, do you?" "What do I have to hide?" "Nothing," said Lael. "Not yet." Rudd tried to press him, but he wouldn't speak any further. They stayed idly near the river another half hour, then wandered across the trestle and climbed a shale draw to the dull hospital green water pipe winding along the mountainside. Rudd watched Lael put his feet on the bolts at a joint, climbed up the side and onto the top. He stood balanced atop the pipe. "Come on up," he said. "No," said Rudd. "What?" said Lael, suddenly interested. "Don't you love your brother enough to join him?" "It's got nothing to do with you," Rudd said. "I can't stand heights." "Hell, Rudd," said Lael. "You just climbed the side of a mountain." "That's different," said Rudd. "There's no drop, just a steady slope." "Could kill you either way. Come up." "No." Lael danced atop the pipe. "Come on," he said. "It's perfectly safe." He squatted and reached his hand down. "If you can't trust your brother, who can you trust?" "It isn't that," said Rudd. "Trust me. Prove you're my brother. Trust me." Later, Rudd thought, "I am only his half-brother. I can only trust him halfway." But at the time, he did not think it. Instead, he reached out, took his half-brother's proffered hand, put his foot on the bolt, let himself be drawn up. He was on his hands and knees atop the warm pipe, not moving, the world slowly swaying around him. He felt Lael drag him up, felt his brother's hands pushing him, the world slowly yawing and turning. Things were going dim. After that, he remembered nothing. He awoke in a hospital, his mother beside him. His arm was broken, and a cast to the elbow, his head wrapped in gauze. There were cuts up and down his arm. "What happened?" he asked. "You're awake," said his mother, then slapped him hard. "Don't you ever," she said. "You're lucky I came at all." "Lael brought me?" "What?" she said. "You brought yourself in." "Where's Lael?" "Lyle who?" "No," he said. "There's—" "Listen to me," she said. "It was just you." He was given pills. He listened to her talk, her voice blurring and growing faint. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, she was gone, Lael occupying her place exactly. "Why'd you do it?" he asked Lael. "Do what?" "Push me." "I didn't push you," Lael said. "You let yourself go." Rudd went home, asking the desk on the way out who had admitted him. They looked up the file. He'd driven himself in, broken arm and all, on his scooter. Each day his mother changed the dressing on his head, bathing his cuts with lukewarm water. The arm began to itch in his cast, and he scratched inside on the first with a pen, and then with a bent coat hanger. At school, the novelty of a cast got a few people to talk to him who normally didn't acknowledge him. He invited them to sign his cast. "Get well," most wrote. David Nimblett wrote, "Injured in the line of duty," and drew a saluting stick figure. Brian King, smirking, wrote, "Break a leg." Then the doctor cut the cast off and his life went back to normal, only his forearm was smaller and lumped in the middle. He would not see Lael, he told himself the first weekend his cast was off, but by noon he was sick to death of his mother and changed his mind. He drove with one hand, precariously, the injured arm resting against his thigh. He saw Lael once a week after that. He knew immediately something was different, yet it took days for him to realize Lael had started making a game out of everything, testing him. Lael offered the oddest appeals to brotherhood at the oddest possible moments. Outside of these moments, he did not mention their being brothers at all, as if brotherhood were a kind of bond activated only in extremis. Most of the time, Lael was detached, hardly present. Only at those moments where he dared Rudd to do what he would otherwise have avoided did Lael turn fully toward him. This turning was unpredictable, hardly encouraged by the same thing twice. It could come in his trying to convince Rudd to turn around and lie down while the scooter was in mid-flight, to put his chest on the back rack and hang his fingers down close enough to the ground to brush against the asphalt, or in suggesting that Rudd throw a rock at a dog or a window. But it could be something simpler, like forcing Rudd to ask a question of an attractive girl working at JCPenney. Indeed, Lael always had an ability to single out from a very different situation what would make Rudd most uncomfortable. Rudd himself never could guess when his half-brother would turn toward him, call him brother, try to coax him into a painful fellowship. 3 months later, cruising south on farm roads near Spanish Fork, Rudd looked over Lael's shoulder, saw the gas gauge was near empty. "We have to get back to town," he said, speaking loud against the wind. Lael slowed, then sped up again. Rudd leaned forward, putting his mouth near Lael's ear. "Turn around," he said. Lael didn't look back, didn't slow down. Rudd pushed up against him, reached past to tap the gas gauge. "We're almost out of gas." "Just a mile more," said Lael. "Then I'll turn around." "Where are we going?" "Nowhere." They drove past a farmhouse, then a whitewashed barn, lines of fences with cattle scattered behind them. A drainage pipe appeared, opened into a narrow, slow-moving creek. "Lael," he said, "just a little more." They went through a crossing, past an old rusted-out tractor that was rolled off the road, nose first into a ditch. The barbed wire fencing gave way to the simple split rail, the pasture to an organized field, thick with the crenite leaves of a plant he couldn't identify. Then another field, this one corn. A feed truck rattled fast, flecks of hay swirling across the windscreen and over their faces, tufting on Lael's shirt and in his hair. An old man in a red Chevy 2-ton waved slowly, as if underwater. "Lael, now," Rudd said. "No," said Lael. "What?" "I'm not turning back." "What do you mean?" Let's see how far we can go. But we won't get back, Rudd shouted. Who cares if we get back? I do, he said. And then when Rudd didn't answer again, I do. Rudd reached forward, tried to pry Lael's hands off the grips. Lael held fast, their scooter swerving slightly. Swear to God, said Lael. Keep that up and I'll kill us both. Rudd let go and gave up. He leaned back, kept silent until he heard the engine sputter and surge, then die. As they coasted to a stop, he got the sense somehow, through the back of Lael's head, that his half-brother was smiling.